Welcome to my channel, Veracity Trigger, and I wanted to talk about Dark Knights a little bit, but I want to focus on one particular Dark Knight that I think a lot of people miss in the Final Fantasies. Now, when you look at Dark Knights in Final Fantasy, probably the greatest Dark Knight that most people think of is Cecil from Final Fantasy, I want to say 4. I hope it's not 5. I always get 4 and 5 mixed up for some reason. The way that it is before 6, I just get it mixed up. So if I mess up the numbers, I'm sorry. But Cecil in Final Fantasy is a Dark Knight. He initially starts off with the Kingdom of Baron, and you know, I could go more into the story of that, but I kind of want to focus on Cyan a little bit more. But he turns from a Dark Knight into a Paladin later on in the game. And he's initially portrayed with dark blue armor. He has the darkness skill, which drains his hit points to do damage to the enemy, which it's okay. I've tried it. I'd rather just do his attack because I don't have to heal him up. But you play as him. A lot of people know him. But as far as going into Cyan is concerned, a lot of people are going to think of him as a samurai because he does wield katana blades. I'm not exactly sure which version says Bushido, or if the Japanese version of Final Fantasy says Bushido instead of Sword Tech. But in the North American version, what we got with the SNES, it says Sword Tech, portrays him as a soldier, a swordsman, kind of gives us this European feel of a knight. And when you use his Sword Tech skill, use his Sword Tech skills, his sword that appears looks more like a Kriegsmaster. It doesn't look like a katana blade. Now, I've actually used medieval swords. I've fought with them before. I've done some fencing. I've done a little bit of different kinds of sword martial arts, and it doesn't look like the katana blade. The katanas are kind of like banana shaped in the way that they're curved. Now, you could say the game developer was lazy and they just didn't want to do it, but the amount of art they actually put into Final Fantasy, I highly doubt that. I just doubt that. And if that really was the case, then even then, that's still a minor thing. But to me, it looks like a Kriegsmaster. I'll have to put the description of a link below to let you see what I'm saying. But that's a Germanic sword that's single-edged and has a long hilt. And it's a longer blade. It's close to a hand-and-a-half sword, or also known as a bastard sword. But let's kind of move forward a little bit here, and we'll talk about the Dark Knights. Now, typically Dark Knights are usually portrayed in blue, like a dark blue armor. Now, Cyan has this. His name is Cyan, which means blue. So, I mean, it's almost like there's a lot of little hints that keep pushing towards him. Now, let's go forward a little bit more too. Now, when we look at the Final Fantasy world and how they portray certain jobs, it's a way of looking at it. Well, how to describe this best is basically they pull out some stories and they show you the stories, and they kind of put the skills in with that character associated with that story, and that character, because of the story, takes up this job role. And they do this with Final Fantasy. So the story, the job, the skills, they all match. They usually all go together. Let's say, if we were going to talk about Dragoons. Okay, well, for the most part, even with Final Fantasy 14 compared to Final Fantasy 6, or not Final Fantasy 6, but with Kain from before Final Fantasy 6, Kain, he has the elements of betrayal. Kain has the elements of betrayal. Estinian has the elements of betrayal. They both wear blue armor. They both yield a lance. They have the jump attack skills. I mean, this is already consistent with how Final Fantasy does things. A lot of it is very consistent with the ways that they portray the characters, the way they portray the skills, the story. They all kind of go together. They all kind of mesh. They're not exact copies, but they share a lot of very similar elements in the theme of the story and the theme of the skills. And it's not always the same thing with the theme of the weapons, because if we go all the way back to Final Fantasy 1, every character that played a certain role usually got a particular kind of weapon, but then we get to the very end of the game and we're able to take a little detour to find the Mazmune, and the Mazmune is it's supposed to be a samurai weapon. It is a samurai weapon from Legend, and anyone can equip it in Final Fantasy 1. So it's to say from the very beginning, anyone could almost in essence be the samurai from Final Fantasy 1, because the first knight that was there was called a fighter, and then he turned into I think he turned into a knight. I think he turned into a knight or a warrior or something like that, but he just kind of upgraded. But he could use regular, like, medieval swords, shields, axes, and the like. And then you can also give him the Mazmune if you want. But you could give the Mazmune to a ninja. You could give the Mazmune to a white mage. You could give the Mazmune to a black mage, which makes no sense. But you can give it to him. Anybody can equip the Mazmune in Final Fantasy 1. We go into Final Fantasy 3, the Japanese version of it, and it's basically shown that the Dark Knights can equip the katana blades. They can equip the samurai blades. So, you know, we look at the Dark Knights throughout the history of Final Fantasy, they equip a variety of weaponry. So when we look at Cyan, and it says in here, you know, he is the master swordsman, the master of the... Actually, it says in the book, it says the master of the sword. At the very beginning of what it's trying to describe as his sword tech skills, the master of the sword, which means any sword, really. You know, it's not one particular type or brand. Even in Final Fantasy here, you'll see me have him use the scimitar, which is not a typical katana blade from the Japanese era. It's a different type of weapon. I think it's an Indian blade. You know, and his weapon looks more like a Germanic sword as far as the skills go. But then he can also equip the samurai katana blade. So he is a master of the sword. And what we see with Dark Knights is they can equip all kinds of weapons. I have to leave the link in the description below to let you see all the different types of weapons that they can equip. They can equip so much more than the other knights can. I mean, the typical knight is going to equip a knight sword or a regular sword. And then you see with the samurais, they're either going to equip katana blades, and if you play some of the online versions, they can do spears and bows. But it's not that much of a variety, and it's not a huge variety of sword-like weapons. It's mostly just restricted to the samurai blades and possibly with the online games, spears and bows and stuff. Because in the ancient... as far as samurais go, they could use those weapons, and they did use those weapons for war. But when we look at Dark Knight, I think I've already repeated this a number of times, but as far as the weaponry goes, the weaponry for Dark Knight is never consistent. It's never consistent. This is what it is 100% of the time, all the time. No, it's basically Dark Knights are just master weapon wielders, and that's why they do so much damage. So we have to look at the way that the stories are connected and concerned in this and that. And we can look at the story, and we can look at the skills. I think I'm going to go into the skills first to kind of help you kind of see, you know, where I'm coming from. And until they made Final Fantasy 14, it was kind of hard to see so much. I mean, there were some elements that you could kind of see, but until they made Final Fantasy 14, I think a lot of people were kind of on the boat, you know, on the same boat as far as seeing Cyan as the samurai, because he has the sword tech skills. You know, I think either it was said in the Japanese version it was Bushido. I don't remember right at this moment, but the skills really portray the type of character. And so when we look at the skills as far as the Dark Knight skills go, Cyan has an attack called Stunner, which does a raining attack on the enemy, some kind of multi-attack on the enemy that can cause stop. Now we also see this Final Fantasy Tactics Advance with the Dark Knights in there. They can cast an attack that can stop the enemy. Now this is done by Dark Knights. So Cyan has something in the Dark Knight skill realm already that's already been done before. And actually it's been done, well, with Tactics Advance it'll probably be later, but it's already portrayed that this is a Dark Knight skill. Cyan has this skill. Now we also look at Empowerer. This is probably the most quintessential skill that they give Dark Knights, and it's a skill that drains the enemy of their hit points and gives you hit points back, hit points and MP. So it's going to give you life back. Now with Dark Knights, what we see is they typically deal with the elements of life and death, and that's to drain hit points from the enemy, or to drain their own life force to do more damage to the enemy. And that's kind of how the storyline goes too. And it's kind of a thing about a self. It's a story about the self, your personal self, and the afflictions that you go through. And so when we see Cyan doing this Empower attack, this is something they've already done with Dark Knights already, to drain enemy hit points. This is not a samurai skill. This is not a samurai skill that they use for the samurais. Samurai job classes have different types of skills that they do, that Cyan is not really portraying as far as the samurais go. He doesn't have those skills. He has Dark Knight skills. And so this Empower is pretty much just like Soul Eater, or it's a lot like Soul Eater, but I mean, if I had to reference it to Final Fantasy 14, I would probably say it's a little more like Soul Survivor, because that drains hit points and MP from the enemy that's about to die. Now, when it says in the book, it says if Cyan's hit points are low, you can use Empower and drain back a lot of hit points. And it does give a lot of hit points back. It depends on how much the hit points the enemy has, and you really can't control who Cyan's going to attack with it. But if they have a lot of hit points, and Cyan doesn't have a lot of hit points, it's going to drain a lot. So that's already something Dark Knights do. That's something Cyan does. And then we look at Slash. We can actually reference that to Final Fantasy XIV's Scourge. It looks identical, actually. If you look at the pic that I can even put up there, it puts this negative space around the enemy, which could be kind of like seen as the Dark Knights are opening this void up around the enemy, and doing this attack on them that causes this continual bleed on them. Now with the Dark Knight in 14, I know the other tanks and other things have bleed attacks, but with the Dark Knight, they have it look like a red swing attack, and that's the same way they have Cyan do his Slash attack. It's a red swing attack, and they both create dots on the enemy that do damage over time. That looks pretty darn identical. Now, if we go back to Dispatch, Cyan's Dispatch looks exactly identical to Plunge, without the little flipping motion, but I think if they did the flipping motion in Final Fantasy VI, it would have looked goofy. So they had him do this very, very fast plunging jump motion towards the enemy with his sword, and he hits him with it, and they do the same with 14, with Plunge. It looks just like that. You're just boom, you're right on the enemy with your sword. And they look the same. Another one that Cyan has that they put in 14 also is Reprisal. Looks exactly, well, it has the same exact thing as Retort. When you do Retort in Final Fantasy VI, Cyan draws his sword really fast and he waits for the enemy to attack him. The sword isn't like shown anymore, but it's known that if the enemy attacks him, he's going to counterattack with a very strong hit. And that's what Reprisal does in 14. When you parry an attack, you're given the option right away to counterattack with a move, but it's not the option for that attack isn't left open forever. It's only for that small amount of time, which is pretty much the same thing you do in Final Fantasy VI. If Cyan's turn rolls over again and you did Retort and nothing happened, no one attacked you, now you have to do a new type of skill move, a new type of fight move, a new item move, use magic, whatever, but you're not given that option again. You have to start over with something new. So it's the same thing in Final Fantasy XIV. When you get Reprisal, you only have like a 5-second window to do Reprisal, or you don't get to do it at all. So Retort and Reprisal, you can look it up. They mean the same thing. They're counterattack on the enemy, and you only have a short window to do either of them. And so Cyan already has these skills, and they're already putting them in 14 to reminisce from Cyan Garamonde from Final Fantasy VI. The only other two skills that Cyan has that are not in Final Fantasy XIV, or at least, I suppose if you do the macro the way I did, I've done a macro video about Dark Knights, and if you macroed a certain way, you could get an attack for the Dark Knight to look like a 4-way attack. And Cyan does a quadra-slice attack, and that's just a little bit of theory crafting on my part that I just think that's interesting. But then Cyan ultimately gets a move called cleave, which is instant kill move. And I think some people will say, well, samurais get an instant kill move, and so that's quintessential for that. And that's a little bit possible, but that's what I want to talk about at the end of the video, because I'm still kind of at the beginning of the video right now. So kind of in the middle, I suppose. But so all these skills that he has a stop move, he has a drain hit points MP move. A lot of the moves they put in Final Fantasy 14 reminisce from the old Final Fantasy Cecil's Cyan Garamonde for the Dark Knight class, or the Dark Knight job. And so we look at that, and it's like they're drawing the elements of Dark Knight from Cyan Garamonde. Why would they do that if everybody believes that he is a samurai? You got me. I mean, I've thought he could be a samurai over the course of time, and, you know, I didn't really have a problem with it. I didn't think there's really a big deal to think, like, okay, samurai, I get it. You know, he uses katana blades and stuff. But as I looked at his skills and I looked at his story, and I'm playing Final Fantasy 14, as I'm playing through it, I'm thinking, holy cow, Cyan was really a Dark Knight, and we never figured it out. Nobody really figured it out. Nobody thought about it, because the story in 14, the elements of the story match up with Cyan Garamonde. Okay, you'd be like, how is that possible? Okay, well, let's look at the beginning parts with Frey, and we'll talk about that. And I'm going to also go over something other outside of the Final Fantasy realm to give you maybe a bit of theory crafting as far as where they got the idea for Frey and Rexol. We look at the initial parts of Cyan. He goes through. Well, let's even go beyond Frey. Okay, let's look at the initial parts of Cyan, and he starts off. The first thing you really see with Cyan is that you know, he's defending from the Empire, and then Kefka comes in. He kicks out General Leo with a lied letter saying, "General Leo, go home. You suck. This is the Empire. This is Emperor Gestral." And so then Leo goes home. Kefka poisons the river to kill off all the rest of the soldiers. Doesn't care if he kills his own guys too. That's the way Kefka runs things. And so then Cyan is like, how could they do this? They kill off Cyan's wife, his child, his liege, most of the rest of the soldiers. There's possible that some may have survived. I mean, if Cyan survived, it's possible some other ones have survived, but they're not story quintessential. So he goes out enraged, and he fights against the Empire. Now, this isn't something that I think, as far as Bushido is concerned, would be the right way to do it. I think as far as the ways of Bushido, if you are dishonored in some way, it's more than likely that the samurai would commit seppuku and just kill themselves. Now, putting this into a video game would be pretty radical, I would think, but in a way they kind of put it in there with Setzer, with Joker Doom, where you gamble and you can kill the whole party yourself, everything. And he gets the ability GP Rain, which is something that samurais typically get. So that's just another little thing that I wanted to point out. I'm not going to go into that too much right now, but wanted to basically say is that, you know, he loses everything. He goes enraged. Not something that I would think of as a typical samurai way of doing things. And he goes through all this grief and anger, and there's times where he'll be talking to himself before you get on the Phantom train. And then while you're getting on the Phantom train, he's still talking to himself. Now, why is somebody so into their own emotions and ideas? Now, that's kind of something they usually portray with the Dark Knights. And they kind of did this with Cecil too. And, you know, he has to fight himself, this mirror image of himself. And he has this voice that's supposed to be from his father. And so it really is a portrayal of looking at yourself at a deeper meaning. And when we go a little more into it, we see Cyan, like, talking about, you know, the death of his wife. You know, how could this train be here because Doma's railways were destroyed? He's not really talking to you. You know, he's talking to himself. He's kind of in this repressed this repressed emotion. And you get on the train, and then Sabin is the one that gets on the train, and then Cyan's like, no, we got to get off because of the train of the dead. He just finally figures it out because, well, there shouldn't be a train here. This feels weird. And then he kind of remembers, I guess, maybe a story or prophecy or something. I don't remember the initial words of how Cyan understands this, but he figures it out. And when you get on the train, Cyan's like, well, we all have to go sometime. I mean, that is not something typical for the other characters' stories. Dark Knight stories are depressive. You'll see it when you play Final Fantasy 14 and Frey's talking to you, and he's basically telling you how people are using you, for their own just causes, and what you should really be doing is protecting the innocent. Now, when we go into the other parts of Dark Knight stories, as far as protecting the innocent goes, we see this with Cecil protecting Rydia from King Baron, his own king, kind of going against, his own master, like bite the hand that feeds you, to protect this innocent, because she's only still a child, and she can do this summon technique. She summons Titan, and she's a very special child. But beyond being just a special child, it's like, as a Dark Knight, this is where they start the beginning of what they want the Dark Knight to be, the protector of the innocent. And so you see this kind of portrayed in Final Fantasy VI when Cyan meets Gaio. His name is probably Gao, but I always say Gaio, so you have to forgive me for that. But we look at that, and he protects Gaio from the Videlt. He kind of rescues him from the Videlt in a way, gives him some meat, and he's like, hey, come on, let's team up. Gaio has some valuable information. Gaio's a special child too. He can learn the attacks of the enemies on the Videlt that only any other 14-year-old boy wouldn't be able to handle the strength and the attack from other monsters bare-fisted. I just don't see it. But Gaio can. He's a special child. There's another part where Cyan is... It could also be part of a psychological thing where, Cyan lost his family, he lost his son, he lost his wife. Maybe Gaio is, in some ways, a psychological replacement for his child. He's, because he had a wife and a family and was taken away from him so abruptly, he's not able to cope with the situation at hand. So he still has this feeling of protecting his son. His son's not there. This child wants to be kind of like a son to him because this child doesn't know his father, and you'll see this later on as you play Final Fantasy VI. He's always talking about, oh, father? He doesn't understand. The guy who just doesn't understand. He was kind of thrown into the wild and sort of raised like I think Janus, I think that's the thing. Janus was raised by wolves, the Roman prophecy, I suppose. But guy who just doesn't understand his father, and I think he kind of looks up to Cyan as like a fatherly figure. And so you see this paternal thing with Cyan and Gaio. You see the same thing with Cecil and Rydia. And then you go into Final Fantasy XIV, and you see this this other Dark Knight come along. His name is Sigurdu. I'm just going to say Sid because I cannot say the name for the life of me. I've tried this so many times already. Can't say his name. But he's protecting a child too. And this child has dragon blood inside of her in Final Fantasy XIV. Yes, there's a lot of spoilers ahead. If you didn't realize it by now, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to. So he's protecting her too. And she's being pursued by the Temple Knights because they want to say, well, she's got dragon blood in her, she's a heretic, let's throw her off a cliff. That's over. End of story. Praise alone. So that's kind of the whole point of it. But there's all these paternal, protecting the innocent themes that they put with the Dark Knight, and we see this with Cyan too. So we see the repressive anger with Cyan. We see all that repressed anger with the Dark Knight theme. And we see that with Cecil. Not quite so much, as much as I remember seeing with Cecil, but it's there. It's definitely there. And I remember playing the game, but I don't remember there being as much dialogue because I think when they made the other Final Fantasy with Cecil, they didn't really develop the story quite as much to be felt more so. Final Fantasy VI really did that very well. I think some people are still a little upset it wasn't quite as deep, but with you trying to portray 14 characters through a game, I think they did very, very well with what they did with 14 characters. I mean, most games will only have like 5 probably. This has 14. Now, 2 of them don't really talk at all. 2 of them really can't have much of a story. I mean, Umero is a beast, Mog is a Mog, and they're just kind of cute kind of characters, and there's really not much more to say about them. But let's go a little bit, sorry, I get off topic sometimes, but with Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy VI, they both have the same exact element, where you have a hooded figure. Literally, it's shown, they're a hooded figure, they're an entity of what you don't exactly know. They tell you what, you know, or people tell you what they think it is, but you don't exactly know what it is. It's in 6 it's a composite spirit of souls, and in 14 it's a darker version of yourself, I suppose. But either way, they're kind of portrayed as like demon-esque in form, where they want to possess you, you know, where people will think, oh, there's now this possession coming into play. And you see this with Final Fantasy VI. The dream demons, the dream stooges, are kind of like dream demons, and they show you kind of dream scenarios as you go along. And with Final Fantasy XIV, you see Frey kind of talking to you in sort of a dreamlike state, you know, where you don't really understand what he's saying. He's just saying a couple words, but it feels dreamy in the way that he's kind of talking to you. And you find out later on he's dead. He's already been dead. It was never really alive. It's just this other entity that's taken his body, apparently. It's just taken his body, and it wants to possess you and just do bad things, because you see at White Brim it attacks everybody. You know, and they're your friends. You know, they know you. They're kind of like your friends. And in Final Fantasy VI, you know, you hear stories about Rexol. And later on you go in the castle and you go in there, these dream demons are trying to attack you, but as you go further along, you find out from the spirits of Cyan's dead wife and dead child, Elaine and Owen, you find out that they talk to Cyan, they talk to you, and they're like, save Cyan, save his soul. And you'll literally ask them, they're like, where are we? And they'll say, you are inside Cyan's soul. So it really turns, each of these kind of turns the story on their head as far as you feeling like you're in a dreamlike state into the reality of you're in a nightmare. Because when you come into Final Fantasy VI, when you get to the end, you're going to fight Rexol, but he's like, I'm consuming all the hatred and the anger from Cyan, and I hunger for more. I hunger for yours. And he wants to possess you as well. So it's not just a dream anymore, because even in the dream state in Final Fantasy VI, there are parts that you see Cyan exploring that you've never seen before. Now, in a dreamlike state that you're jumping into, you wouldn't really have the ability to see what you haven't seen before. Now, I think we could probably go into that, and that could be a little more, and I think some people might say you can, but I just don't see how that's possible. I don't see how that's possible if you're even able to see someone else's dreams, their experience, their past. But especially when you go a little bit deeper and it turns from the dreamlike state into a very yellow background, and the spirits come out, they literally say, save Cyan's soul, and then the demon wants to possess you as well. You know, and beyond that, you have to fight this demon from this other realm. The only real way to kill him is to send him to another dimension, and with the X zone. I mean, you can try killing him the other way, but it probably takes forever. I've never tried it myself, but after the battle, if it was a dream, if it truly was a dream, you would not really gain a skill. You could gain a skill, possibly, but you would not gain Magicite. You wouldn't gain anything physically from a dream. We know this. This is the reality of things. When you come out of a dream, you wake up, you don't gain a physical item. It's not like the tooth fairy. It's not like that. So when you come out of the dream and the demon just says it's going to possess you, you know, you wouldn't gain a real physical thing. And what you gain is the Magicite Alexander. This Magicite Alexander comes up in other Final Fantasies. In Final Fantasy IX, it protects the city from Bahamut. But in here, you gain the Magicite Alexander, which uses an attack called Justice. And it does this fire attack on everything, just turns everything to flames. And it basically, in some ways, you could think of it as him purifying the land with fire. And so it's like this theme of justice, protecting the innocent. They do come into play with the Dark Knights. And so what you get is that materia, its ability, its spells, and Cyan learns his final skill called cleave. Now with Final Fantasy XIV, when you finally have to fight the other entity that wants to possess you, it literally tells you it wants to possess you. Let me take over. Let me take control. You know, and I'll show you, you know, how bad all these other people are. And then you have to fight that to subdue it, but you don't fully subdue it. But he lets you use his skill to do Living Dead. Because in Final Fantasy XIV, Dark Knight is a tank. You need tanking abilities, and this is one way to do it. So, yeah, they drew upon those elements of this dark entity trying to possess you. And in both instances, you need your friends to save you. In a way, you need them to save you. They need to give you the encouragement for you to feel better. Because throughout most of the storylines for both of these stories, how they're very similar, you are mostly in a very repressed mood. You're talking to yourself sometimes. You know, you're talking about yourself. You're only feeling the feelings that you feel because of what's happened to you. You're not really looking at an outside perspective. And if you do, it's still from an inside perspective. And if you look at Final Fantasy VI with Cyan, before you even get to the point where you're going to go into Doma Castle, when you rescue Cyan from Mount Zuzu, you don't really rescue him, he's just there. You find him, he's got all these beautiful flowers made. And it's like, well, what woman would have done this? Because most people would think a woman would create flowers. Guys aren't really that into flowers for the most part, at least none that I know. And so, you know, and as far as the story goes, you kind of assume, you think, oh, maybe this is, I don't know, maybe this is Terra, because in Mount Zuzu, beforehand, Terra went there to meet Ramha, then she started to learn more about herself. She had a dream there. So you think, well, maybe Terra's there. And, you know, but it's not. It's Cyan. And so you find out Cyan comes back, and he starts hiding all these flowers. He's like, oh, no, I can't let him see that I've made these things. And so he starts hiding them all, and he's almost done with the ability to hide them all, and then you catch him, and he's like, well, I have a confession to make, you know, I've been doing this for a while. And then Cyan realizes he needs to fess up to what he's been doing. And what he's been doing is he's been sending love letters to a woman named Lola in the town of Miranda, from letters that he's writing them out in the stead of her dead boyfriend to her as love letters. And so it's seen kind of in a psychological way that he hasn't been able to get over the death of his wife and his child. And so what he's doing from this point is it's almost like a mind thing where he's wishing that she would still send him love letters to him, because it's possible that Cyan was a scout, not like a scout, like a Boy Scout, but like, a scout that would go out and scout the enemy territory. It's sort of seen in his dream a little bit. But it's sort of the way that it's sort of seen in a way that he wishes his wife would still be alive and still be doing these things for him. So if he was a scout and he was scouting enemy territory, his wife would probably send him letters, and wherever the letter master would send the letters to, wherever Cyan was, his post, or where he camped out or something like that, he would get these letters. And so he probably looked at it like he kind of wishes that would still continue. So he's sending this other woman love letters, and then once he's sending her love letters and he's sending her flowers and stuff, and then so he finally gets, the party meets up with Cyan, and then he has to give her like a final letter. And I think what you do is you send her these letters back and forth through pigeon carrier, and eventually it's kind of a romance in a way, but eventually he has to go up and fess up to her that, you know, her boyfriend is deceased, and, you know, he's been doing these things for a while, and so he kind of has to come to reality to realize that, you know, he needs to just open up and tell the truth about it. But it's really a little bit more so about himself. He needs to open up and tell the truth that, you know, he can't pretend anymore like nothing's happened. It's almost like he's been pretending, and that's why when you get to Doma Castle, he's had all that internal pressure built up inside of him that it was easy for an entity to take control of him. And so, you know, that's another part of the psychology I wanted to talk about. But let's go a little bit more deeper beyond that. Now, the idea of the Dark Knight, and I've been looking this up, and I think I found a partial part of the story to it as far as the idea goes. And it seems interesting when I looked up this thing called Il Separato, or I Wanna Separato. I don't know, I'm just going to say Separato. I'm probably saying that wrong too. I'm just going to say Separato, and I'll put the links in there below. But when you look at Separato, the story is of a Dark Knight. The story of Separato is about a Dark Knight, or a Black Knight, whichever one you want to say. But this Dark Knight would go and assassinate these people for money. It's kind of like a mercenary in a way. He would just take things out, and it didn't matter who or what it was, he could always get the job done. I mean, he was a professional at what he did. And so later on, he kind of has a change of heart. You know, I could leave the story below. He sort of has a change of heart, and then he goes back after the people that sent him after the people he was supposed to kill, because he realized the people he did kill weren't all that bad. And so he goes and he tries to do this, and eventually he's rescuing a monk. He's, you know, trying to escape with the monk, but he gets cut. It's not a mortal cut, but as he's trying to get to the next town, he sort of bleeds out, and he's laying next to a tree, and he's saying, you know, this monk's like, God bless you, and he's like, I don't believe in God, or I don't believe in the devil. And so then these two angels appear. One is a heavenly angel, the other one's a demon, and they're like, well, we want to both claim their soul, you know, to go to heaven or go to hell. And then this other entity appears, and it says, neither of you shall have him. And it's sort of this cloaked, hooded figure, kind of represented like death. And it appears, and it says, because the good and the bad that you've done equaled each other, you can't go either way. You're coming with me. And, you know, if you let me, I can take possession of you and let you live forever. And so that's kind of the story as far as how it goes. And he basically says to him later, he says, it doesn't matter if you do good because bad things will happen. It doesn't matter if you do bad because good things will happen. And so, you know, it kind of goes into that, and I guess the Dark Knight gets to live forever at this point. As far as the story of Separato goes, and what Separato was, if you read the Bible or if you read creation, it was basically when God created light and darkness. Between the light and darkness, there was the separation. That was Separato. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad, it was just there. And so, you know, it was like an entity outside of God himself, because of how things were just made. So, you know, that's kind of what the story is. I don't know as far as how much it's still kind of like a legend, I suppose. But as far as how they represent it in Final Fantasy, I find it really interesting. Okay, there's a Dark Knight that gets possessed by an entity that's a cloaked, hooded, figured entity. And they do this in Final Fantasy, and I'm seeing this in the story from a previous legend. Now, you can't tell me when you've played Final Fantasy that they don't use gods and other elements from other types of legend. They do. Odin is in there, Shiva's in there. There's all kinds of things from other god type, like, beliefs out there that are incorporated into Final Fantasy all the time, and there's usually a high ability for them to reuse the same one they've used in the previous one. Odin's been in so many Final Fantasies in a continuous state for so long that in some ways he's almost looked at like he is the guardian force, esper, or summon figure to what represents a Dark Knight. And it seems like that because in Final Fantasy XIV, when you beat him, there's or when you're about to fight him, the quest for it is Dark Divinith. You know, it's a dark divinity. But, you know, he uses the Zantazuke, and his ability is to cleave the enemy. And it's the first time you see in a Final Fantasy where a particular character can cut the enemy in half. And what happens with cleave is it doesn't do any hit point damage at all. You see 0 hit points taken away from the enemy. It just instantly cuts them in half. There's no more hit points. There's no more enemy. It's like they never existed. They were just split into 2, and they're gone. And so it's the one instance where you'll see in a Final Fantasy where it won't say max damage, like 9999, or whatever they do with the current Final Fantasies where they want to go beyond that quadruple 9 level damage thing. It just doesn't show any hit points. They're just dead. They're gone. It's like a death spell in a way. But in any case, and even in Final Fantasy VI, Odin has a love story where it's cut short because he's been attacked by another mage master in the War of the Magi, and he had to counterattack anybody that would fight against his castle. And his queen was secretly in love with him, or blatantly in love with him, I can't remember which one, and they had a love affair. And so he had to defend the castle, and he eventually loses to an Esper, which was a ghost, because he can cleave all the enemies, but he can't cleave an ethereal spirit. So he wasn't able to do anything, so the ghost turns him to stone, and turns the queen to stone, and later on, he levels up when you talk to the queen with the Magsite of Odin, and he turns into Raiden, which is amazing. I mean, you don't typically see the summons or the gods or any of that like class up or get better. You just don't see it. But that's one time where you really do. And so when we look at the Dark Knight stories, sorry, that was just an interesting thing. It's a little bit of a theory that I think that Odin is the Dark Knight version of what the Dark Knight stories. It's like the stronger version of it, you know, the godlike version of it, as far as what Final Fantasy wants to portray. But as far as the Dark Knight stories go, Final Fantasy XIV draws a ton of elements from Final Fantasy VI's Cyan Garamonde. And, you know, that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the I've been talking for a while, the psychology behind it. I wanted to talk about the skills that are represented with it, because with the Dark Knights, and even when you see with the later Dark Knights, it's seen as people expect to see Dark Knights with certain skills. And the skills are typically hit points. They're basically about life and death. It's the self. It's about the ego as far as yourself is concerned. And I don't mean like you got a big head. I'm saying like you're really feeling for yourself and the tragedies that you've gone through, and you know what you have to go through in life. And so that's kind of the story behind it, and that's why they put the types of skills into there where you're draining the life force from the enemy, sort of like Alucard's Soul Steal. You know, you have this ability to drain their life force from you because you feel this much power within you. And yeah, so I wanted to talk about that. I made a different recording of this, and it was very long. I know this one is getting close to, I think, 40 minutes, or maybe this is 50 minutes at this moment. I don't know. It's hard to see on this, what I'm looking at. But I hope that really described a lot. I've done so many takes of this right now that I just kind of want to be done. I know I could probably take more time and do this a little bit better and things like that, but I've already done so many takes, and there's a lot of information. There's a lot of things that you have to point out back and forth between other things. And because of the course of time, because 14 wasn't, I mean, it's only come out so many years past, but now when they bring out the Dark Knight story and they're taking it, what they're typically going to do is they're going to take stories of a particular character from the essence of a previous Final Fantasy character. And I'm kind of surprised most people would be talking about the Dark Knight story and be like, well, where did they get the story from? Or where are they getting this character inspiration from? And I'm thinking, how could you guys not imagine that they would take it from a previous Final Fantasy? They've already taken a bunch of the previous Espers and Guardians and all the same thing, and it's all the same thing in the next game too, because it's a number title. You know, it just keeps moving on. but they share the same elements, and that's the reason why Final Fantasy is successful, because people like seeing those elements in the game. They like to see them return. That's why it's a success. The initial Final Fantasy that came out, from my understanding, was that they named it Final Fantasy because their previous titles flopped. They failed. They weren't good as far as what a consumer would buy. That, you know, that I've read about them a little bit, and they're very intricately detailed. They're very difficult. And so when they made the Final Fantasy, it's like, well, this is the final product because we got to have something sell. So they put everything that they could into it as far as their imagination goes and the design goes, and it became success. And that's why you see the crystal elements continue throughout the Final Fantasy. The crystal elements are there. Typically it always started with 4, and sometimes it was 6, and sometimes it's 8, where it's like the light and dark versions of the normal earth, fire, water, wind. But mostly the crystal element is always a continuous theme. And they will keep doing that again, and they'll change the story slightly every single time, but they're going to keep doing it over and over again. The same with the job classes. They're going to keep putting in the same job type classes in every single game. In most parts, they're going to let you class up, like they do in Final Fantasy 1. Even in Final Fantasy 14, you start off as a class, and then you turn into a job. In Final Fantasy 1, you class up because of Bahamut, and you become a better version of yourself. And so that's what you're going to see, a continuous thing continue to happen throughout all the history of Final Fantasy, as far as they want to go. And so that's what you're going to see, and that's what I like about it, and that's what a lot of people like about it, and that's great. And if the designers are watching this and they're listening to me, thank you for listening this far, and I hope you continue to do what you're doing, because it's a great way to keep this game going. Keeping some similar story elements and putting them in there, even if you copy kind of the same thing, like 14 is kind of a copy off of Final Fantasy VI's Cyan Garamonde as far as the characters go. Estinian from Final Fantasy 14 is sort of a copy from Kain from, I think it's Final Fantasy 5. I probably messed that one up so much. Final Fantasy 5 and Final Fantasy 4, I always mix those up. But Estinian is a copy off of that. There's the story of betrayal that goes with both of them. And, you know, they're both Lancers. And, you know, they both, you know, want to prove how good they are. And so, and they usually wear blue armor. So it's kind of like that. That's kind of how Final Fantasies do things. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Keep that essence going. But, you know, that's just what I wanted to say. And I just wanted to, I just think I'll just finish this up here. If there's anything else to talk about, I'll just make an addendum to it or another video to go over any other thoughts or ideas or something like that. But yeah, I just wanted to show you, you know, how people probably missed Cyan as a Dark Knight. Now, whether he does, this is the end of the video, so I guess I'm going to say basically whether he does evolve from a Dark Knight into a Samurai in kind of a vice versa, where Cecil leveled up from a Dark Knight to a Paladin. Possibly. I mean, he gets a skill cleave. Other samurais get insta-kill skills in some sense in some of the previous Final Fantasies. But I almost want to think that he's more like the essence of the regular Dark Knight. He's like just an upgraded version of the Dark Knight. You know, because he can use a scimitar. That's not a Japanese blade. And, you know, and the scimitar is actually identical to what Odin uses when he cleaves through the enemy, and then Cyan gets the skill cleave too. Other characters can use the scimitar also, but it's interesting because Cyan can use this weapon when most of his other weapons are katanas, and his skill blade looks like a European sword. So I found that very interesting, and that's why I'm just not so set on seeing him as exactly a samurai. As far as the letters and the flowers that he sends to Lola, I'm not sure if that really represents the samurai Bushido ways too much. I mean, they were a little more into aristocracy and, you know, keeping up with literature and keeping up with trying to be a little more open to life. And it's possible he's kind of evolving into that. I could say it's a possibility, but it's, I don't know, it's hard to see. Now with all the future information that I see that I can draw from what they've taken from the past, and typically they don't try to take elements from different stories and drag them in and say, well, this is now for this kind of job, but it was for that type of job. Now this is for this kind of job. They don't mix you up too much at that. They usually let you see kind of the same thing they've been doing for a while. Like when you're playing this, Terra, people can just say, well, I'm pretty sure she's the black mage of Final Fantasy VI. I'm pretty sure, because she starts out with fire spells. That's what you see with Final Fantasy I with the black mage. You know, that fire spell is a very powerful spell, you know, that she does. We can see Umero as the berserker. That makes sense, because he can throw people into the enemy and he just constantly attacks and you can't stop what he does. You know, so we see some similar elements continue throughout the time and time again. And I'm going to put up some, and I think I'll just say that to conclude. So whether you want to see him as evolving from a Dark Knight to a Samurai, or a Dark Knight to, let's say, I can't say a Paladin, that's not what I would say, would not say Paladin, but like a Dark, he's evolving from a Dark Knight to a Samurai, or he's evolving from a Dark Knight to a Knight. That's a hard one. That's a very difficult one. The skill cleave itself is identical to Odin's attack, and that's, I don't know. I just think that they're probably trying to give a Dark Knight a very powerful attack at this point in the Final Fantasy series. And so, I mean, we could debate that a little bit, but beyond that, I'm just going to end the video right now and just say, well, some of the stuff you're going to see, I'm going to put some links in there to let you see what I'm talking about. You can go and look at that. I'll see if I can try to copy some of the links into the video and put it in the video itself. But what I'm also going to do is include some gameplay that I have done. This is from my original SNES, and some other people played the file and changed the names on me. So what you're seeing here as Umero is, his name is Beast, and Gaiu's name is Kull, I guess the Conqueror, I suppose. So yeah, I'm sorry that's that way, but that's the way that they named it. And so yeah, thanks a lot for watching all the way through this. Sorry it's an hour long. I was trying to make it a lot shorter. The other ones I did before this were a lot longer than this, so this one's a lot better. But if you want to, even if this is years past and this is years gone by and you're listening all the way to the end of this, go ahead and leave me a comment. I'll probably still see it and I'll probably still reply. And have a great day, everybody, and let me know if you liked it. If you'd like to give it a like, subscribe for more if you want to see more of this, and yeah, I got nothing else to say. Take it easy, everybody.